Grover Cleveland, the 22nd President of the United States. Stephen Grover Cleveland is the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. He has the distinction of being the 22nd president from 1885 until 1889, and then the 24th president from 1893 until 1897. Cleveland was a bachelor while he came to the White House. He was not the only president to marry while president. He was the only one to have the marriage ceremonies in the White House. On June 2, 1886, President Cleveland will marry 21-year-old Frances Folsom. The president was 48 at the time. Cleveland was considered honest and hardworking. After leaving the White House for the second time in 1898, he will retire to Princeton, New Jersey, where he will serve as trustee of Princeton University from 1901 until his death on June 24, 1908, from a heart attack. President Cleveland was 71 years old, and at the end of his first term, he has said to the White House staff, "Take care of things, boys. I'll be back in 4 years." And he was. Frances Folsom Cleveland, the 22 and 24th First Lady of the United States. Frances is the nation's youngest First Lady at the age of 21. She married President Grover Cleveland during his first term in office. She became a very popular First Lady. She will be the first First Lady to give birth in the White House. 4 years after her husband's death in 1908, Frances will marry Thomas Preston in 1913 until her death on August 29, 1947, at the age of 83. Benjamin Harrison, the 23rd President of the United States. President Harrison will serve 1 term from 1889 until 1893. Benjamin is the grandson of the 9th President of the United States, William Henry Harrison. Benjamin Harrison was the first president to have his voice recorded. Technical advance during Harrison's reign. The president had the Edison Electric Company to install electricity for the first time in the White House. It has been said that the president nor his wife would touch the light switch, afraid of being electrocuted. They would sometimes even sleep all night with the lights on, afraid to turn them off. Harrison's wife will die from tuberculosis on October the 25th, 1892. Harrison will refuse to campaign, leaving the second term to Grover Cleveland. Harrison will marry his wife, Caroline's 37-year-old widowed niece, Mary Scott, against his other grown children's wishes. He will have 1 child with Mary. Harrison, on March 13, 1901, will pass away from pneumonia at the age of 67. Caroline Scott Harrison, the 23rd First Lady of the United States. Caroline is 56 years old when she becomes First Lady. She'll marry Benjamin Harrison on October 20th, 1853. Caroline had improvements made to the White House. She organized the Daughters of the American Revolution and served as its first president, donating money and persuaded Johns Hopkins University to accept women. In late 1891, Caroline was diagnosed with tuberculosis. She left for the Adirondack Mountains for recuperation. After her condition became terminal, she returned to the White House. Caroline Harrison will pass away October the 25th, 1892, at the age of 60. After Grover Cleveland's second term, William McKinley, the nation's 25th president. He will serve 1 term and began a second from March 4th, 1897 until September the 14th, 1901. On January the 25th, 1871, he will marry Ida Saxton. President McKinley will lead the nation to victory in the Spanish-American War. He will keep America on the gold standard. And on September the 6th, 1901, while attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, President McKinley will be shot twice by an anarchist. In the days after the shooting, he will seem to improve, but gangrene was setting in the linings of his stomach. On September the 14th, 1901, President William McKinley will pass away from an assassin's bullet. The president was 58 years old. Ida Saxton McKinley, 25th First Lady of the United States. Ida was 49 years old when she became First Lady. The McKinleys had two daughters, Catherine and Ida. Ida, the second daughter, will die the same year she was born, and Kathleen will pass away at the age of 3 from typhoid fever. Ida will never recover from her daughter's death. Her health will grow weaker, and she will become depressed and develop epilepsy, sometimes having severe seizures at public functions. The president becomes very protective of his wife and always keeping her close. Jeannie Hobart, wife of McKinley's vice president, will serve as hostess for Ida. After her husband's sudden death in 1901, Ida's health will become worse, and she'll pass away 6 years later on May the 26th, 1907, at the age of 59. Theodore Roosevelt, 26th President of the United States. He will serve 2 terms, finishing the term of William McKinley from September the 14th, 1901 until March 4, 1909. Roosevelt, at the age of 22, will marry Alice Hathaway Lee. Their daughter Alice will be born on February the 2nd, 1884. 2 days after the birth of their daughter, Theodore's wife Alice will suddenly die from Bright's disease that had been masked by her pregnancy. 2 years later, he'll marry Edith Crowell on December the 2nd, 1886, a childhood family friend. They'll have 5 kids. The president was most proud of his extended protection of federal lands and wildlife. His foreign policy was speak softly and carry a big stick. On October the 14th, 1912, while Roosevelt was campaigning for an unsuccessful run for president, while making a speech, he was shot by a Milwaukee saloon keeper. He continued giving a 90-minute speech while bleeding from the wound. The bull moose will suffer another shock when one of his sons will be shot and killed while flying a plane during World War I. He will never fully recover, and in the early morning hours of January the 6th, 1919, President Roosevelt will pass away in his sleep from a blood clot reaching his heart. He was 60 years old. Edith Crowell Roosevelt, the 26th First Lady of the United States. Edith Roosevelt was 30 years old when she became First Lady. During Edith's tenure as First Lady, the Executive Mansion, as it was called then, will be changed to the name White House. She'll be the first First Lady to travel abroad on a trip to Panama. She was described as the always gentle, high-bred hostess. After the White House, Edith supported her husband in his many adventures. Edith Roosevelt will pass away at her home in Sagamore Hills on September the 10th, 1948, at the age of 87. William Howard Taft, 27th President of the United States. William Taft will serve 1 term from March 1909 until March 1913. He'll be known for being the heaviest president, weighing 330 pounds. Under President Taft, 2 states will enter the Union, both in 1912, Arizona and New Mexico. After leaving the White House, President Taft will be appointed to the United States Supreme Court. He's the only person to have been both President and Chief Justice. Taft's health will begin to decline. He was even hallucinating, but refused to resign until President Hoover promised that he would appoint Hugh Evans in his place as Chief Justice. Less than a month after resigning, President and Chief Justice Taft will pass away at his home in Washington on March 3, 1930, at the age of 72. Helen Herron Taft, 27th First Lady of the United States. Nellie, as she was called, became First Lady at the age of 47. She'll marry William Taft June the 19th, 1886. They'll have 3 children. 2 months after becoming First Lady, Nellie will suffer a stroke, impaired her speech, arms, and legs. With help from her sisters, she continued her First Lady functions until she recovered. Nellie, along with the Japanese ambassador's wife, will oversee the planting of cherry trees around the Capitol in Washington. She arranged the planting of over 3,000 trees. Nellie was against prohibition, but she served liquor at the White House receptions. She was the first First Lady to smoke cigarettes in the White House. After her husband's death in 1930, she will live another 13 years and pass away on May the 22nd, 1943, at the age of 81. Theodore Woodrow Wilson, 28th President of the United States. Woodrow Wilson will serve 2 terms as President from 1913 till 1921. On June the 23rd, 1885, Wilson will marry Ellen Laxton. They will have 3 daughters. During Wilson's presidency, he will struggle to keep the nation out of war in Europe. Wilson will become a wartime president in 1917, and after the war, Wilson will support the forming of the League of Nations. But he was unable to get the United States to join. On August 6, 1914, President Wilson will lose his wife Ellen. On 18 December 1915, a little over a year after Ellen's death, he'll marry Edith Bowling Galt. 2.5 years into his second term, in September 1919, President Wilson will suffer a severe stroke. Believed to have suffered brain damage, his wife Edith and doctor will shield the president from lawmakers. Edith will claim that Wilson was whispering his wishes to her in ruling the government. Lawmakers tried to get Wilson's vice president to take the presidency. He refuses. Edith will continue passing instructions to cabinet leaders. The 19th Amendment was passed during Wilson's administration, giving women the right to vote. President Wilson will leave the presidency in 1921 at the end of his second term. On February the 3rd, 1924, President Wilson will pass away from a severe stroke. He was 67 years old. Ellen Laxton Wilson, 28th First Lady of the United States. Ellen was 52 years old when she became First Lady. During her first 3 months as First Lady, Ellen will host over 40 White House receptions with an average guest list of 600. 2 of her 3 daughters will marry in the White House. It is not known when Ellen learned that she had Bright's disease, but she kept the news from her family. It was 3 August 1914 when the doctors told the president of her painful disease. Ellen Wilson will pass away at the White House August 6, 1914, at the age of 54. Warren G. Harding, the 29th President of the United States. He'll serve from March 4, 1921 until August 2, 1923. On July the 8th, 1891, Warren will marry Florence Killen DeWolf, a widow with 1 son. By 1919, Harding was aware that he had heart ailments. In the first half of 1923, Harding made his will. Stressed from his job as president and worried about his wife Florence's health, learning that she had a chronic kidney condition, Harding began losing energy. On a long trip to Alaska and Canada and up through California, With a heavy schedule, he was resting in bed in San Francisco at the Palace Hotel, listening to his wife read newspaper accounts when he collapsed on 2nd of August 1923 from pneumonia and heart disease. President Harding was 57 years old. His body was taken by train from San Francisco back to Washington, D.C. Florence DeWolf Harding, the 29th First Lady of the United States. Florence DeWolf married Warren Harding July the 8th, 1891. She was divorced with one small child. Florence will become First Lady at the age of 59. It's believed that she may have wrote the president's inaugural speech. She is reported to have said, upon reaching the White House, "Well, Warren, I've made you president. Now what are you going to do with it?" Florence made her opinions known to cabinet members, especially the ones that she helped pick. She was the first Lady to have the right to vote. She was one of the most independent First Ladies to reach the White House, even discreetly serving alcohol during Prohibition. By 1923, both Harding and Florence were suffering from life-threatening illnesses. At the death of President Harding, she would not allow any autopsy. There is a possibility Harding's doctor made the wrong diagnosis and prescribed stimulants that helped kill him. The First Lady, though extremely frail herself, she accompanied the President's body back to Washington on a long, hard train ride, attended ceremonies at the White House and a burial at Marion, Ohio, on November 21st, 1924. First Lady Florence Harding will pass away from kidney failure a year after her husband. She was 64 years old. John Calvin Coolidge, Jr., 30th President of the United States. Calvin Coolidge was served the remainder of Harding's term, from August 2, 1923 until March 4, 1929, winning one term of his own. He will help restore confidence in the presidency after corruption scandals surfaces about his predecessor. He will make Native Americans citizens of the United States. He will refuse to run for a second term, stating it takes a great toll on a man and his family. Coolidge was called the quiet man. He was simple, and he rented his house until after he retired as president. Less than 4 years after leaving the presidency, he will pass away of a coronary thrombosis on January the 5th, 1933, at the age of 60. Grace Coolidge, the 30th First Lady of the United States. Grace was 44 years old when she became First Lady. The Coolidges was considered to be a loving couple and family. Grace was considered to be a gracious hostess at the White House. Within the first year of her husband's presidency, tragedy struck the White House when Grace's 16-year-old son, Calvin Coolidge, Jr., developed blood poisoning from a blister while playing tennis with his older brother at the White House. Although he had several doctors at his side, their son passed away July the 7th, 1924. Some said the president lost his heart. However, Grace, unlike other First Ladies that lost young children, after a few months resumed her duties. She became an exceptionally popular First Lady. She left the White House in 1929 with the public's respect and love. Grace Coolidge will pass away July the 8th, 1957 at the age of 78. President Herbert Clark Hoover, the 31st President of the United States. President Hoover was served one term from 1929 until 1933. Hoover was known for his charity work. He was a multi-millionaire when he became president. 8 months after Hoover took office, the nation will be hit with the Great Depression. The unemployment rate reached 25%. Industry was hit hard. Hoover was against repealing Prohibition, going against most citizens. His last day as president will be March the 4th, 1933. After his retirement, he will outlive his wife Lou by 20 years. At the age of 90, President Hoover will pass away from massive internal bleeding on October the 20th, 1964. Lou Henry Hoover, the 31st First Lady of the United States. Lou was 44 years old when she became First Lady. She married Herbert Hoover on February the 10th, 1899. They had 2 boys. As First Lady, she discontinued the New Year's Day reception while the nation was in depression. She was the first First Lady to broadcast on radio on a regular and nationwide basis. Lou Hoover will pass away of a heart attack on January the 7th, 1944 in New York City. She was 69 years old. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States. President Roosevelt is the longest-serving president in U.S. history. He will serve 3 4-year terms and start his 4th. From March 4, 1933 until April the 12th, 1945. He will deal with the National Depression and become a war president during World War II. He will accomplish all this while being unable to walk from being stricken with polio. President Roosevelt will die in office while at a presidential retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia, from a cerebral hemorrhage. He will die on April the 12th, 1945. He was 63 years old. And Eleanor Roosevelt, the 32nd First Lady of the United States. Eleanor Roosevelt is the longest-serving First Lady in our history. She married Franklin Roosevelt, her 5th cousin, on March 17, 1905. Although she will have 1 daughter and 5 boys, the marriage was off to a rocky start. The marriage became more of a political union than a romantic union. As First Lady, she immersed herself in social programs for the poor. When she received news from Warm Springs that her husband had fainted and she was needed back at the White House, she said, "Okay, after I make my speech." The doctors knew that he was already dead when they sent the message. She said she guessed as much. She notified her sons who were in the military. She told Vice President Truman, who asked if there was anything that he could do for her, and she replied, "It's not me, but you that needs help now." She will continue her charitable causes for the next 17 years after her husband's death. Eleanor Roosevelt will pass away from a combination of tuberculosis and heart failure while in New York City on November the 7th, 1962. She was 78 years old. Harry S. Truman, the 33rd President of the United States. He will serve for the remainder of Roosevelt's term plus a term of his own from April the 12th, 1945 until January the 20th, 1953. Truman will inherit the remainder of World War II. He will be faced with one of the most difficult decisions ever made by a president, whether or not to use the atomic bomb over Japan. He issued an executive order to integrate the military. And in the last years of his administration, he will be faced with the Korean War. In November 1950, 2 Puerto Rican nationals tried to assassinate President Truman and actually killed a White House policeman. One assassin was killed and the other was wounded. On December 26, 1972, almost 20 years after leaving the White House, President Truman will pass away from lung congestion and pneumonia and multiple organ failure. He was 88 years old. President Harry S. Truman had a high school education and is consistently considered in the top 5 of all-time best presidents. Elizabeth Wallace Truman, the 33rd First Lady of the United States. Bess Truman was 60 years old when she became First Lady. Bess was quite different from her predecessor, Mrs. Roosevelt. Bess did only the minimum social functions. She was once asked by reporters why she didn't like to answer questions. She replied she was not the one who was elected president. Bess was asked if she ever wanted her daughter to become president someday. She said, "Most definitely not." Bess Truman would pass away 10 years after her husband on October the 18th, 1982, at the age of 97. Dwight David Eisenhower, the 34th President of the United States. Dwight Eisenhower was served 2 terms as President from January the 20th, 1953 until January the 20th, 1961. One of President Eisenhower's lasting achievements as President was the authorization of the interstate highway system in 1956. The growing spread of communism prompted the U.S. to concentrate on overthrowing unfriendly governments that sympathized with the communists. During the Korean War, Eisenhower threatened to use nuclear bombs if China would not come to the negotiating table. China, knowing Ike's reputation as a World War II general, agreed to a ceasefire in Korea. 8 years after leaving the White House on March the 28th, 1969, President Eisenhower will pass away with congestive heart failure at the age of 78. Mamie Dowd Eisenhower, the 34th First Lady of the United States. Mamie was 56 years old when she became First Lady. She married Dwight Eisenhower on July the 1st, 1916. She was 19 and Ike was 25. She will have 2 boys. Her first son, Dowd, was called Icky, will die of scarlet fever at the age of 3. Mamie was known to be a penny pincher, they say. She would actually clip out coupons for the White House staff. She became a social trendsetter while First Lady. After leaving the White House and her husband's death in 1969, she will support Richard Nixon for president, and on September 25th, 1979, she suffered a stroke and was rushed to Walter Reed. While in the hospital, she told her granddaughter that she would die the next day, and she did, on November the 1st, 1979, at age 82. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States. President Kennedy never finished his first term, serving from January 20th, 1961 until November the 22nd, 1963. President Kennedy's administration spent most of time dealing with Russia over the Cold War, including the Cuban Missile Crisis and the beginning of the Vietnam War. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was the 4th sitting president to be assassinated in office. He was shot and killed on November 22nd, 1963, at the age of 46. Jacqueline Kennedy, 35th First Lady of the United States. Jackie was 31 years old when she became First Lady. She will marry John Kennedy on September the 2nd, 1953. She will have 3 children. Caroline, John Jr., and Patrick will be born while Jackie is First Lady. Patrick will live only 2 days. When she arrived at the White House, she began a program of finding and restoring historical presidential furniture and paintings. She represented the nation as First Lady with courage and dignity when her husband was assassinated. After his death, she worked on his presidential library. And in 1968, she will marry shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis until his death in 1975. Jackie will pass away of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma on May the 19th, 1994, at the age of 64. Lyndon Baines Johnson, the 36th President of the United States. President Johnson will finish the term of John Kennedy's, plus 1 term of his own from November the 22nd, 1963, until January the 20th, 1969. President Johnson was a major figure in passing the Voter Rights Act in 1965. Johnson initiated the War on Poverty, dropping the rate of people's living in poverty from 23 to 12%. He became bogged down in the Vietnam War. Soldiers were dying and students and blacks were rioting throughout the country. President Johnson refused to run for another term, telling the nation, "If nominated, I will not serve." He returned to his ranch in Stonewall, Texas, and at 3:39 p.m. on January the 22nd, 1973, President Johnson placed a call to the ranch's Secret Service compound, complaining of severe chest pains. They found him in his bedroom, unresponsive, with the phone still in his hand. President Lyndon Johnson was 64 years old. Claudia Taylor Johnson, 36th First Lady of the United States. Lady Bird Johnson was 50 years old when she became First Lady. She married Lyndon Johnson on November the 17th, 1934. They had 2 daughters. They will be teenagers in the White House. While First Lady, Lady Bird will initiate a national campaign to beautify the nation. She campaigned on her own across the country for her husband's election, and 4 years later she was the one that did not want him to run again, afraid it would damage his health. 24 years after the passing of her husband, on 2007, July the 11th, she will pass away at her home of natural causes. Lady Bird Johnson was 94 years old. Richard Milhous Nixon, 37th President of the United States. President Nixon will serve from January 20th, 1969 until August 9, 1974. President Nixon will be given credit for ending the Vietnam War and bringing the POW prisoners home. President Nixon's trip in 1972 to China will start diplomacy relations between the two countries. He will end the military draft. Nixon was forced by the Watergate scandal to resign or face impeachment and removal. President Nixon resigned on August 1st, 1974. President Nixon will be pardoned by Gerald Ford. He will write several books during his retirement years. On April 18, 1994, President Nixon will suffer a debilitating stroke and pass away 4 days later on April 22, 1994, at the age of 81. Thelma Ryan Nixon, 37th First Lady of the United States. Pat Nixon was 56 years old when she became First Lady. She married Richard Nixon July the 21st, 1940. She will have 2 daughters. As First Lady, she secretly invited Jackie Kennedy and her 2 children plus Rose Kennedy to visit and dine at the White House to view President Kennedy's official portrait. It had been 8 years since the Kennedys had been to the White House. She oversaw the White House wedding of her daughter, Tricia, in 1971. When she learned the president was thinking of resigning, Pat didn't want him to. She wanted him to stay and fight. She said he had done so much for this country. Why is this happening? After retirement, she will seldom make public appearances. She will precede her husband in death by 10 months. Patricia Nixon will pass away at 5:45 a.m. on June 22, 1993, at the age of 81. Her daughters and her husband will be at her side. Gerald R. Ford, the 38th President of the United States. Jerry Ford will serve 1 term from August 9, 1974 until January 20, 1977. Ford will marry Betty Boomer on October the 15th, 1948. They will have 4 children. As President, Gerald Ford will pardon President Richard Nixon on September the 8th, 1974, for his part in the Watergate scandal. Ford is the only person to resume the presidency and vice presidency without ever being voted on by the public. He will issue a conditional parole for Vietnam draft dodgers if they serve 2 years of community service. There were 2 assassination attempts on Ford's life. First by Charles Manson follower Lynette Squeaky Fromm. She pointed a .45 Colt revolver at him when Secret Services grabbed the gun. The next attempt was in San Francisco, where Sarah Jane Moore fired the first shot while in a crowd, missed because the sights were off. Next shot reflected by a Secret Service agent going 6 inches above and to the right of the president's head. President Ford will pass away December the 26th, 2006 at his home in Rancho Mirage, California at the age of 93. Elizabeth Boomer Ford, 38th First Lady of the United States. Betty Ford was 56 years old when she became First Lady. Betty had been a dance teacher and married once before she met Jerry Ford. Her first husband was abusive and an alcoholic. She married Jerry Ford on October the 15th, 1948. They'll have 4 children. As First Lady, she will be blunt and forthright. She will openly discuss with reporters her problem with alcoholism and substance abuse. She was a staunch supporter of women's rights and made her feelings known. Her approval rating was very high when she left the White House. She established the Betty Ford Center to help victims of alcoholism and substance abuse. First Lady Betty Ford will pass away at the Eisenhower Medical Center, Rancho Mirage, California, on July the 8th, 2011, at the age of 93, from natural causes. James Earl Carter, the 39th President of the United States. President Jimmy Carter will serve one term from January the 20th, 1977 until January the 20th, 1981. Under President Carter, a peace agreement was established between Israel and Egypt called the Camp David Agreement. Carter was able to lower the unemployment rate and decrease the federal budget. Unfortunately, the Iranian confiscation of American embassy personnel and held American diplomats hostage cost him the presidential election. After retiring from the White House, President Carter will be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002 for his work furthering peace and humanity. Eleanor Rosalynn Smith Carter, 39th First Lady of the United States. Rosalynn Carter was 49 years old when she became First Lady. Rosalynn married Jimmy Carter July the 7th, 1946. She had 4 kids. As First Lady, Rosalynn's most important project was for mental health research. She was the President's closest advisor. She also would often read the Bible aloud in Spanish to her mother-in-law. After leaving the White House, Rosalynn initiated the Rosalynn Carter Institute for Caregiving. It focused on caregiving for terminally ill patients. Ronald Wilson Reagan, the 40th President of the United States. President Reagan will serve 2 terms as president from January the 20th, 1981 until January the 20th, 1989. The most notable thing accomplished during Reagan's presidency was the collapse of the Soviet Union. On March 30th, 1981, President Reagan was shot in an assassination attempt by John Hinckley. The bullet pierced the president's lungs. Hinckley was found guilty by reason of insanity. He left office with one of the highest ratings of any president. He had planned to take on several projects when he retired from office, but in 1994 he received the news and revealed it to the public that he had been diagnosed of Alzheimer's. He will stay out of the public eye for the next 10 years. President Ronald Reagan will pass away June 5, 2004 at the age of 93 from complications of Alzheimer's. Nancy Davis Reagan, 40th First Lady of the United States. Nancy was 59 years old when she became First Lady. She married Ronald Reagan March 4, 1952. They had 2 children. As First Lady, she organized the drug campaign, Just Say No. Nancy was known to be protective of her husband, no more so than after his assassination attempt. She turned away even senators and demanded that they leave if she thought that he needed his rest. Nancy was conferring with an astrologer in California. It got to the point that astrologers was telling the White House, through Nancy, when the president should travel, what was good days, neutral days, and bad days. White House Chief of Staff Ronald Reagan said it even interfered with decisions that the president made. These decisions had to be approved by some woman in California. Donald got so mad at Nancy over the astrologer, he hung up on her on the phone. When the president found out, he asked his chief of staff to resign. Reagan did. After the president left the White House and it was discovered that he had Alzheimer's, Nancy became his primary caregiver and protector. For 10 years she stayed by his side until his death. Almost 12 years after her husband, Nancy Reagan will pass away of congestive heart failure on March 6, 2016, at the age of 94. George Herbert Walker Bush, 41st President of the United States. President Bush will serve one term from January the 20th, 1989 until January the 20th, 1993. President Bush started the negotiations for the North America Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, that Bill Clinton will sign. On January the 1st, 1991, President Bush will launch Desert Storm, restoring Kuwait oil fields back to Kuwait. President Bush will have Panama President Manuel Noriega removed from power for trafficking narcotics to the United States. While leaving office, President Bush will order executive clemency to former Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger and 5 others indicted for being involved in the Iran-Contra scandal back in the 80s. In July 2015, President Bush threw out the first pitch for the Houston Astros at the Minute Maid Park at the age of 91. President Bush sent a letter to President Trump in January of 2017, giving him his best. Barbara Pierce Bush, 41st First Lady of the United States. Barbara was 63 years old when she became First Lady. She married George Herbert Bush on January 6, 1945. She will have 6 children. Barbara will lose a 3-year-old daughter to leukemia in 1953. Barbara will be, along with Abigail Adams, the only 2 First Ladies to have a husband and son to become president. The First Lady was an active supporter for the cause of the homeless and AIDS victims. She was one of the most loved First Ladies by the public for her candor and still very popular with American people. William Jefferson Clinton, the 42nd President of the United States. President Bill Clinton will serve 2 terms as president, from January the 20th, 1993 until January the 20th, 2001. During Clinton's term, he initiated a peace agreement between Israel and Jordan. He also initiated the Don't Ask, Don't Tell initiative, allowing gay men and women to serve in the military. On January the 1st, 1994, Clinton signed the NAFTA trade agreement. President Clinton will be the 2nd president after Andrew Johnson to be impeached. Although he was impeached, the public gave him high ratings as president. When President Clinton left office, he left the country in good economic shape. He continues to make public speeches and helps with several charity foundations. Hillary Rodham Clinton, 42nd First Lady of the United States. Hillary Diane Clinton was 43 years old when she became First Lady. As First Lady, Hillary fought to raise the conscience of the nation about health care, and in 1997 she initiated the Children's Health Care Program. After her term as First Lady, she'll be elected to the Senate and then appointed Secretary of State in the Obama administration. She was the first woman to be nominated by a national party to run for president. George Walker Bush, 43rd President of the United States. President Bush served 2 terms, from January the 20th, 2001 until January the 20th, 2009. On September 11, 2001, fanatical Muslim terrorists attacked the Pentagon and World Trade Center. President Bush will spend the rest of both presidential terms fighting 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. He also initiated the No Child Left Behind Act. He will leave office with the respect of the American people for striving to keep the country safe. Laura Welch Bush, 43rd First Lady of the United States. Laura was 54 years old when she became First Lady. She married George W. Bush on November the 5th, 1977. She'll have twin daughters. As First Lady, she'll become involved in a program to make women more aware of the dangers of heart attacks. She will also become a breast cancer activist. In her husband's second term, Laura traveled to numerous countries representing the United States, and by the time her husband left office, Laura was one of the few First Ladies that the American people were proud to call their First Lady. Barack Hussein Obama, 44th President of the United States. President Obama will serve 2 terms as president from January 20th, 2009 through January the 20th, 2017. President Obama will hold the distinction of being the first black American president of the United States. While president, he will appoint 2 women to sit on the Supreme Court. And in December 2009, Obama will lift the ban on travel to the United States by people who are infected by HIV/AIDS. President Obama initiated the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare. After leaving the White House, the president promised to continue his interest in the Democratic Party. Michelle Robinson Obama, 44th First Lady of the United States. Michelle was 45 years old when she became First Lady. She married Barack Obama October the 3rd, 1992. She'll have 2 daughters. As First Lady, Michelle began visiting homeless shelters and poor communities. She advocated for military families. She supported the LGBT community rights. She supported same-sex marriage. Michelle, as First Lady, represented the United States on several foreign trips. She was well received around the world as America's First Lady. Donald John Trump, 45th President of the United States. President Trump became president on January the 20th, 2017. He was elected for a 4-year term. Donald Trump will become president without ever holding a public office. He is one of the most controversial presidents since Abraham Lincoln. Melania Trump, 45th First Lady of the United States. Melania was 46 years old when she became First Lady. She married Donald Trump the 22nd January 2005. Melania speaks several languages that she used on her first trip to Europe and the Middle East with the president.